I never believed in haunted buildings. If someone told me an apartment complex was cursed, I'd assume they were trying to explain away old plumbing, noisy neighbors, or decades of neglected maintenance. Every strange sound has a logical explanation if you're patient enough to find it. At least, that's what I believed before I took the night maintenance job at Black Ridge Apartments. I won't tell you the exact city because people still live there, and I don't want anyone bothering them. The building itself isn't famous. It doesn't appear in ghost hunting videos or local legends. From the outside, it looks like every other aging apartment block built sometime in the early 70s. 6 floors of faded brown brick, narrow balconies, cracked concrete walkways, and a parking lot that flooded every time it rained. The owners were struggling to keep up with repairs, so they hired another maintenance technician. That happened to be me. The pay was better than anything else I could find at the time. The hours were terrible. Most of my shift ran from 6 in the evening until 3 or 4 in the morning. Residents usually reported problems after work, and management preferred repairs to happen overnight, when hallways were empty and elevators weren't constantly in use. It sounded simple enough. During my first week, the building manager, Richard, walked me through every floor. Richard was in his late 60s, tired looking, the kind of man who had spent so many years solving other people's problems that he'd forgotten how to smile naturally. He showed me electrical rooms, water shut-off valves, boiler controls, roof access, storage lockers. Then we reached the basement. The heavy metal door opened with a groan that echoed down the concrete staircase. The air immediately changed. Cooler, damp. It smelled like wet cement mixed with old dust and rusted pipes. Rows of exposed plumbing stretched across the ceiling. Water heaters hummed softly. Every sound bounced off the concrete walls, making even our footsteps seem louder than they should have been. Richard handed me a ring of keys. "Everything you'll ever need is down here." I nodded. He hesitated. "If you get a work order after midnight," he looked toward the far end of the basement, "finish whatever you're doing before 12. What happens after midnight? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the flashlight hanging from his belt. "You'll understand eventually." Then he started walking back upstairs. I assumed it was an old man's attempt at humor. Over the next several days, I became familiar with almost every resident. Mrs. Alvarez on the 3rd floor constantly complained about flickering lights. A college student kept locking himself out of his apartment. A retired couple insisted someone was stealing their newspapers every Tuesday. Normal apartment problems, nothing unusual. But there was one complaint that appeared almost every night: basement noises. Apartment 102 reported banging beneath the floor. Apartment 104 claimed someone walked through the basement at 2 every morning. Apartment 107 said they heard metal scraping against concrete. Management always wrote the same note under those maintenance requests: "No issue found." At first, I assumed the sounds came from expanding pipes. Old buildings settle. Heating systems make strange noises. Nothing mysterious about that, until I started noticing something. Every resident described the sounds differently. One person heard footsteps. Another heard furniture dragging. Someone else insisted it sounded like chains. One elderly man claimed he heard people whispering, not loud enough to understand, just voices. One evening, I asked Richard why nobody ever investigated those reports. He stared at me for several seconds. Because every time someone goes looking for the source, he stopped. The noise is gone. That wasn't exactly comforting. Still, I wasn't worried. People hear what they expect to hear, especially at night. About 2 weeks into the job, I received my first overnight emergency. A water pipe had burst beneath the laundry room. I grabbed my toolbox and headed downstairs. It was almost 12:30 in the morning. The basement felt different than it had during the day. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. The shadows between support columns looked deeper. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing through the empty corridors. I found the broken pipe within minutes. While replacing a damaged section of copper tubing, I heard something behind me. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Not on metal, not inside the pipes, on concrete. I turned around. Nothing. Just rows of storage cages and gray walls. I listened carefully. Silence. I finished the repair and packed my tools. As I started toward the stairs, the sound came again, this time farther away. 3 knocks. Exactly the same rhythm. Almost deliberate. I walked toward the noise. The basement wasn't very large. At least I didn't think it was. The farther I walked, the quieter the humming pipes became. Eventually, I reached the very end of the hallway. There was only a blank concrete wall. No doors, no equipment, no windows. Nothing that could have made that sound. I stood there for nearly a minute. Then I noticed something strange. The floor was dusty, except for one narrow path. The footprints weren't clear enough to identify. Just disturbed dust leading toward the wall and stopping, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. I told myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe an old maintenance hatch. Maybe someone had moved equipment earlier that day. Maybe I was just tired. I climbed back upstairs. When I reached the security office, Richard looked up from his paperwork.
You were in the basement after midnight. It wasn't a question.
You hear it? I shrugged. Probably pipes. He held my gaze for several seconds. Then he quietly said something that stayed with me long after I left work. No. He folded another maintenance request and slipped it into a filing cabinet. The pipes stopped making those sounds 23 years ago. People hear what they expect to hear, especially at night. About 2 weeks into the job, I received my first overnight emergency. A water pipe had burst beneath the laundry room. I grabbed my toolbox and headed downstairs. It was almost 12:30 in the morning. The basement felt different than it had during the day. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. The shadows between support columns looked deeper. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing through the empty corridors. I found the broken pipe within minutes. While replacing a damaged section of copper tubing, I heard something behind me. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Not on metal, not inside the pipes, on concrete. I turned around. Nothing. Just rows of storage cages and gray walls. I listened carefully. Silence. I finished the repair and packed my tools. As I started toward the stairs, the sound came again, this time farther away. 3 knocks. Exactly the same rhythm. Almost deliberate. I walked toward the noise. The basement wasn't very large. At least I didn't think it was. The farther I walked, the quieter the humming pipes became. Eventually, I reached the very end of the hallway. There was only a blank concrete wall. No doors, no equipment, no windows. Nothing that could have made that sound. I stood there for nearly a minute. Then I noticed something strange. The floor was dusty, except for one narrow path. Someone had walked through recently. The footprints weren't clear enough to identify. Just disturbed dust leading toward the wall and stopping. As if whoever made them had simply disappeared. I told myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe an old maintenance hatch. Maybe someone had moved equipment earlier that day. Maybe I was just tired. I climbed back upstairs. When I reached the security office, Richard looked up from his paperwork. You were in the basement after midnight. It wasn't a question. I nodded. You hear it? I shrugged. Probably pipes. He held my gaze for several seconds. Then he quietly said something that stayed with me long after I left work. No. He folded another maintenance request and slipped it into a filing cabinet. The pipes stopped making those sounds 23 years ago. Not by work boots. Bare footprints. Adult-sized. The prints emerged from the darkness behind me, crossed the hallway, and stopped directly in front of the black door. There were no footprints leading away. I stared for several seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe someone had walked backward. Maybe the concrete texture hid the return prints. I swept my flashlight across every inch of the floor. Nothing. The track simply ended. A sharp metallic click echoed behind me. I spun around so fast my flashlight nearly slipped from my hand. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Every door remained closed. The silence felt heavier than before. Then my radio burst to life. The sudden static nearly made me jump. Maintenance? It was dispatch. You still in the basement? Yeah. There was a pause. You've been down there for over an hour. I looked at my watch. 1:17 a.m. That couldn't be right. Repairing the valve had taken 20 minutes. Walking this hallway, maybe another 5. At most. I should have left before 12:30. I looked back toward the black door. For just a second, I thought I heard breathing. Slow, steady, on the other side. Not loud enough to be certain, just enough to make me wonder whether I'd imagined it. I backed away without taking my eyes off the door. When I finally reached the main basement corridor, the familiar humming of the water heaters returned. The building suddenly felt normal again. Warm, occupied, safe, or at least safer. When I reached the security office, Richard was waiting for me. He hadn't gone home after all. He looked exhausted. You found it. Again, it wasn't a question. The hallway, I said. Why isn't it on the building map? He slowly closed the maintenance logbook in front of him. Then he asked something that made every hair on my arms stand up. You didn't touch the black door, did you? I didn't answer Richard immediately. The truth was, I'd reached for the handle. My hand had been less than an inch away before my radio interrupted me. I was just looking, I finally said. Richard stared at me for several long seconds. Then he let out a slow breath. Good. That was all. No explanation, no lecture. He simply locked the maintenance office, turned off the lights, and walked toward the exit. Before leaving, he stopped, without looking back. If you ever hear someone knocking from that hallway, he paused. Don't answer. The door closed behind him. I stood alone in the office, replaying everything that had happened. The hallway, the footprints, the missing time, 9 locks. None of it made any sense. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. Instead of going straight home, I stopped by the city's public records office. Old apartment buildings usually have archived blueprints available to contractors. I requested the original construction plans for Blackridge Apartments. The clerk disappeared into the archive for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, she frowned. We only have the revised plans. What happened to the originals? She shrugged. No idea. The revised drawings showed exactly what I already knew. 1 basement level, boiler room, storage lockers, electrical room, maintenance office, nothing else. No hidden corridor, no extra rooms, certainly no black door. I asked if there had ever been renovations. Several. Anything major? She checked another file. Mostly plumbing upgrades. No structural additions? No. She smiled politely. According to these records, the basement has always looked exactly the way it does today. I thanked her and left. That should have settled it. Instead, it only made the hallway harder to explain. That evening, I arrived for my shift earlier than usual. Richard was already there, reading maintenance reports. I decided to ask directly. I checked the blueprints. He didn't look up. They don't show the hallway. I know. So what is it? He slowly closed the folder in front of him. I've worked here 31 years. Silence. I've never asked. That answer irritated me. You've never been curious? Oh, I was. He smiled without humor. Curiosity is expensive. Before I could ask what he meant, the office phone rang. Apartment 112. Complaining about noises under the floor again. Richard answered before I could. Did you hear knocking? A pause. He listened. Then asked another question. 3 knocks? Another pause. I understand. He hung up. They heard pipes? I asked. No. He folded the report. They heard a little girl crying. That caught me off guard. There aren't any children in that part of the building. I know. For the first time since I'd met him, Richard looked genuinely uneasy. Last week it was someone laughing. The week before, he rubbed his forehead. Someone said they heard a man asking for help. I felt a chill run through me. So people hear different things. Yes. Why? I don't know. He met my eyes. But it always starts the same way. 3 knocks. Neither of us spoke after that. Around 1 in the morning, another call came in. Apartment 103. The tenant insisted someone was walking through the basement. Heavy footsteps, back and forth. For almost an hour, I volunteered to check. Richard immediately stood. I'll go. I can handle it. No. I know the building. No. His voice was sharper than I'd ever heard before. Then, realizing how he sounded, he relaxed. We go together. 5 minutes later, we were descending the basement stairs. Richard carried an old flashlight, not an LED. One of those heavy metal models that probably weighed 3 pounds. He held it like someone carrying a weapon. The basement seemed unusually quiet. Even the boiler sounded muted. We checked every storage aisle. Nothing. Every mechanical room. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No homeless squatters. No broken locks. Just silence. We were heading back when I noticed something. One of the storage unit doors was open. Only a few inches. Richard stopped walking. I locked these. He whispered it almost to himself. We approached carefully. Inside, the storage cage was nearly empty. A bicycle, several cardboard boxes, old furniture covered with sheets. Nothing unusual. Until I noticed the dust. Someone had written a message across the concrete floor with a finger. 5 words. Stop coming down here. The letters looked fresh. The dust was still piled along their edges. I instinctively looked around. Did someone break in? Richard didn't answer. He was staring at the message with an expression I'd never seen before. Recognition. Slowly, he crouched beside the words. Without saying anything, he wiped them away with his sleeve. Every letter disappeared. We're leaving. What if someone... We're leaving. His tone ended the conversation. We returned upstairs in complete silence. As soon as the basement door closed behind us, Richard locked it. Then he did something I'd never seen before. He slid an additional deadbolt into place. I frowned. I didn't know this door had 2 locks. It didn't. When was this installed? He looked at the steel door for a long moment. 3 years ago. Why? His answer came so quietly I almost missed it. Because 1 lock wasn't enough. I laughed nervously. That was the moment I realized something I should have understood days earlier. Richard wasn't trying to scare me. He was scared himself. And somehow, that frightened me far more than anything I'd heard in the basement.
After that night, I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. Not ghosts, not shadows, people, especially the older tenants. Most apartment buildings have 1 or 2 residents who've lived there forever. They know every repair, every manager, every family that has come and gone. Blackridge had several. I began asking innocent questions. When did you move in? Has the basement always looked the same? Have there ever been major renovations? Most people answered the same way. I don't really remember. It's always been old. I never go down there. Then I met Mr. Calloway. He lived alone in apartment 201, 90, maybe older. Despite his age, his memory was frighteningly sharp. When I mentioned the basement, he looked at me for a long time before asking, "Richard still working here?" "Yeah." Mr. Calloway nodded slowly. I wondered how much longer he'd stay. "You know him?" "I knew the manager before him, and the one before that." His eyes drifted toward the window. "I've watched this building outlive almost everyone." That afternoon, I helped him carry groceries upstairs. Before I left, he said quietly, "You've seen the hallway." I stopped. I hadn't told him about it. "I don't know what you mean," he smiled. "You maintenance boys always say that." A long silence followed. Finally, he motioned for me to sit. "I'll tell you something, but if Richard finds out, he'll be angry." I sat. "Mr. Calloway folded his hands together. "When this place was built, there were 2 basements." I didn't interrupt. "The lower level wasn't for tenants. It housed electrical equipment, emergency generators, water storage, all sorts of things. So why seal it? His expression darkened. They didn't. I frowned. What do you mean? The plans changed after construction? No, during construction. He leaned closer. My brother poured concrete for this building. He came home one Friday and said half the workers had quit. Why? He wouldn't tell me. 2 weeks later, the lower level disappeared from every drawing. I felt my stomach tighten. What happened down there? I don't know. Nobody does. Your brother never told you. He started drinking. He refused to talk about work. Within a year, he moved away. Mr. Calloway looked toward the apartment door as if checking that nobody was listening. 3 years later, the first maintenance supervisor vanished. Vanished? They said he quit, but his truck stayed in the parking lot for almost a month. I said nothing. After him, another supervisor lasted 8 months. Then another. They all left, or so management claimed. The room felt strangely quiet. Finally, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. What about Richard? Mr. Calloway gave a tired smile. Richard's the only one who stopped asking questions. That sentence stayed with me all evening. Maybe that's why he'd survived. Not because he understood the building, because he'd learned not to challenge it. Around 12:40 that night, dispatch called again. Apartment 105. Resident reporting loud footsteps in the basement. I grabbed my flashlight. Richard stopped me before I reached the stairs. You don't have to answer every complaint. If someone's down there, we should check. They're never there. You don't know that. He looked exhausted. I do. I went anyway. The basement was exactly as I'd left it. Quiet. Empty. The leak I'd repaired earlier was still dry. Every storage cage remained locked. I made one complete circuit.
Nothing. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound came from deeper inside. Not loud, not violent, patient. I froze. A few seconds later, another 3 knocks. Closer this time. I turned off my flashlight. Immediately, the basement became almost completely dark. Only a faint gray glow from the emergency exit signs remained. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, just the distant hum of machinery. I switched the flashlight back on. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, someone was standing beside the entrance to the hidden hallway. Too far away to identify. A man, I thought. Tall, perfectly still. I called out, "Maintenance." No response. "You shouldn't be down here." The figure didn't move. I started walking, slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed at his chest. He remained motionless. 30 feet away. 20, 10. Then the beam reached him completely. There was nobody there. Only the concrete wall. The entrance to the hidden corridor. Empty. I was absolutely certain I'd seen someone. Not a shadow, not a pipe, a person. I walked to the exact spot. Nothing. No footprints, no discarded tools, no open doors, only silence. Then my flashlight flickered once, twice. The batteries were brand new. The light dimmed for less than a second before returning to full brightness. Just long enough for me to notice something that hadn't been there before. The black door was no longer closed. It stood open, only an inch. Just enough to reveal complete darkness beyond it. I was certain it had been shut the last time I'd seen it. Even more certain that 9 separate locks should have made that impossible. A cold draft drifted from the opening. It smelled unlike the rest of the basement. Not damp, not moldy. The air carried the dry, stale scent of concrete that hadn't been disturbed in decades. And underneath it, something else. A faint odor I couldn't place. Almost sweet, almost metallic. I found myself taking another step forward. Then another. My hand tightened around the flashlight. The gap in the door seemed to widen, without making a sound. Somewhere beyond the darkness, I heard a voice. Not loud. Barely more than a whisper. It said only 3 words. My shift. A pause. is over. The voice sounded so familiar that I couldn't breathe, because for one impossible second, I was almost certain it was my own.
I don't remember running. I only remember reaching the basement stairs with my heart pounding so hard that I could hear it over my own footsteps. By the time I pushed through the fire door, I was breathing like I'd sprinted several blocks. Richard was still in the security office. He looked up the second I walked in. "You opened it." It wasn't a question. I shook my head immediately. No, it was already open. His face lost what little color it had. How far? What? How far was it open? Maybe an inch. Richard closed his eyes. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he stood. "We're going downstairs. You just told me never to. We're going." His voice was calm now. Too calm. The kind of calm people force themselves into before doing something they don't want to do. He unlocked a cabinet beside his desk. Inside was an old emergency bag, flashlights, a first aid kit, a pry bar, bolt cutters, and something I didn't expect, a revolver. He noticed me staring. "I've never fired it." "Then why carry it?" He locked the cylinder into place. "Because it makes me feel like I have options." That wasn't reassuring. 5 minutes later, we were back in the basement. Everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. The hidden corridor was still there. The black door was closed. Every one of the 9 locks remained in place, untouched. I walked straight to it. There, I swear it was open. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he crouched beside the bottom of the door. "There it is." "What?" He pointed his flashlight toward the concrete. A thin line of fresh dust had been disturbed beneath the threshold, as though the door had moved, just enough to break the layer that had settled there. Richard didn't say another word. He simply stood up and started walking away. When we reached the security office, he opened a filing cabinet I'd never seen him use. It wasn't labeled. There was no alphabetized system, just dozens of plain brown folders. Every folder had a year written across the front. He selected one marked 2003. Inside were maintenance reports, incident forms, photographs. Most of them involved the basement, missing tools, broken lights, unexplained water leaks, noise complaints. Then I found something stranger, printed screenshots from security cameras.
Dozens of them. Every image showed the same basement corridor, same angle, same lighting, same empty hallway, until the final photograph. Richard placed it in front of me without saying a word. At first glance, it looked normal. Then I noticed a figure standing near the hidden hallway, a maintenance worker. Blue uniform, flashlight hanging from his belt. His back was turned toward the camera. The timestamp read, October 14th, 2003. "Who is he?" Richard answered quietly. "My partner." I looked back at the photograph. "What happened to him?" "He finished his shift. And he never came upstairs." The words hung in the air. I waited for more. Nothing. "You mean he disappeared?" Richard nodded once. "The police searched the building. They searched the city. They even broke open sections of the basement walls. They never found him." I looked at the photograph again. Something bothered me. The figure seemed wrong. Not transparent, not ghostly. Slightly blurred, as though he'd moved the instant the camera captured the frame. Richard slid another photograph across the desk. Same hallway, different year, different camera, different maintenance worker. Again, standing near the hidden corridor. Then another, and another. Each photograph was years apart. Different uniforms, different people. Always the same position. Always facing away from the camera. Always near the black door. "How many?" I asked. Finally, he said. I stopped counting after 6. A chill spread through my chest. "You think they all disappeared?" "I think the building remembers them." I wanted to dismiss the idea. I really did. Buildings don't remember people. Concrete doesn't think. Doors don't wait. But the evidence sitting on the desk was impossible to ignore. I pointed toward one of the photographs. "Where are the camera recordings?" It was the saddest laugh I'd ever heard. "They're gone." "What do you mean?" "Every recording, every hard drive, every backup. The only thing that survives," he tapped the printed photographs, "is whatever someone happened to print." That made no sense. Digital files don't simply erase themselves while printed copies remain, unless someone deleted them or wanted them deleted. The thought stayed with me the rest of the night. Around 3 in the morning, after Richard left to inspect a rooftop ventilation unit, I remained alone in the security office. I couldn't stop looking at the photographs, one by one. Different years, different workers, same hallway. Then I noticed something I'd missed before. Each photograph had been taken at exactly the same time. 1:17 a.m. My stomach dropped. That was the time I'd looked at my watch in the hidden corridor. I pulled out my phone and checked the picture I'd secretly taken of the black door the previous night. The image loaded slowly. For a moment, I thought it was completely black. Then I increased the brightness. The door was there, the locks were there, but reflected in the steel, standing directly behind me, was another maintenance worker. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at me. The timestamp in the corner of the photo read 1:17:03 a.m. I spun around. The office was empty. When I looked back at my phone, the reflection was gone. The photograph now showed nothing except the door, as if it had never been there at all. After that photograph, I stopped trying to convince myself that I was simply exhausted. Something was happening inside Black Ridge Apartments. Whether it was human or something else, I couldn't say. But I knew one thing. I wasn't the first person to notice it. The next afternoon, I came to work early. Richard wasn't there. Instead, I found a handwritten note taped to the maintenance office door. "Emergency plumbing repair. Basement. 5:30 p.m. No signature." I grabbed my toolbox and headed downstairs. The basement looked completely ordinary. Tenants were moving bicycles in and out of their storage lockers. A delivery driver was unloading supplies for the laundry room. Everything felt normal. Almost too normal. The broken water line turned out to be behind an old concrete service wall near the boiler room. To reach it, I had to remove several rusted steel panels that hadn't been opened in years. The bolts fought me every step of the way. When the last one finally came loose, the panel shifted with a deep grinding sound. A rush of stale air poured through the opening. Cold, dry, completely different from the damp basement behind me. I shined my flashlight inside. Concrete stairs, leading down, not up, down. There was no mention of these stairs on the building plans. I stared for several seconds before calling Richard over the radio. Only static answered. I tried again. Nothing. No signal. But this time it felt deliberate. I stepped through the opening. The staircase was narrow, bare concrete, no handrail. The steps were covered in dust so thick it looked untouched for decades. Except someone had recently walked down them. Fresh boot prints. Not mine. Large, heavy work boots. I followed them. The staircase ended at a steel fire door hanging slightly crooked on rusted hinges. Unlike the black door, this one wasn't locked. It had simply been left closed. The beam from my flashlight disappeared into an enormous underground room. It was far larger than the basement above. Rows of concrete columns stretched into darkness. Old electrical panels lined one wall. Rusted water tanks stood along another. Everything looked abandoned, yet strangely intact. It wasn't a cave, it wasn't a tunnel. It looked exactly like what Mr. Calloway had described. The original lower basement, level 2. Dust covered almost everything. Almost. A plastic bottle of water sat on one of the electrical cabinets, half full. The label hadn't faded. Nearby was a fresh battery, still in its packaging. A disposable flashlight, an unopened protein bar. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. I slowly swept my flashlight across the room. There were more signs. Empty food wrappers, a folded blanket, a camping chair. Not enough for someone to live comfortably, just enough for someone to wait. I felt that strange pressure again. The feeling that someone was already watching me. Then I heard it. A distant metallic clang. Not random, measured, like a pipe being struck once, far away. Several seconds later, another, closer. I switched off my flashlight. Darkness swallowed everything. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing. Only silence. Then, one soft cough. Somewhere among the columns. Human. Without thinking, I called out. Maintenance? No answer. I know someone's down here. I'm not calling the police. Still nothing. I waited. Nearly a minute. Then a voice answered, very quietly. So you're the new one. The voice belonged to an older man, calm, almost conversational. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Only pillars disappearing into darkness. Who are you? No reply. Instead, I heard slow footsteps, not approaching, circling, always staying just beyond the edge of the light. Crunch. Crunch. Every step echoed differently, making it impossible to judge the distance. I can hear you, I said. I know. The answer came from somewhere else entirely. Behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Empty concrete. The footsteps stopped. Then the voice spoke again. You shouldn't stay after 1:17. Every muscle in my body tightened. How do you know about that? No response. Instead, another question. Did Richard finally show you the photographs?
The flashlight trembled in my hand.
Who are you? Several seconds passed. Then, I used to work here. A maintenance worker, just like me. My mouth suddenly felt dry. What happened to you? The silence stretched so long that I thought he had left. Finally, I never found the stairs. I frowned. What stairs? The ones back. A cold sensation spread through my chest. What are you talking about? No answer. The footsteps resumed. Slow, patient, moving deeper into the darkness. Without thinking, I followed. One row of columns. Then another. Then another. The flashlight beam barely reached 15 feet ahead. Every direction looked identical. Concrete, dust, darkness. After several minutes, I realized something horrifying. The boot prints I'd been following were gone. I turned to look behind me. The doorway, the staircase. The light from the basement above had disappeared. There was only darkness, complete darkness. For one impossible moment, I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. Then my flashlight flickered, just once. In that single heartbeat of darkness, I heard dozens of people breathing, all around me, waiting. When the light returned, I was no longer alone. At the edge of the beam, between two concrete columns, stood a man in blue maintenance coveralls. His back was turned toward me. A flashlight hung from his belt. His shoulders were slightly slumped, as though he'd been standing there for years. Slowly, very slowly, he raised one hand, not to point. He simply lifted a finger and gestured for me to follow him. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The man stood perfectly still. His back faced me. The blue maintenance coveralls looked old, faded almost gray beneath the weak beam of my flashlight. There was a tear across one shoulder. His work boots were covered in dust. His flashlight hung from the same kind of leather belt clip the maintenance department had stopped issuing years ago. Everything about him looked ordinary. That was the worst part. If I'd seen some impossible creature standing there, I might have reacted differently. Run, scream, do something. Instead, I found myself staring at someone who looked exactly like another maintenance employee finishing a late shift. He lifted his hand again, one slow motion. Come here. I swallowed. Sir? No answer. I'm with building maintenance. Nothing. His arm lowered. He started walking. Not fast, not slowly, just a steady pace. The sound of his boots echoed through the enormous underground chamber. One step, then another. Without realizing it, I followed. Every instinct told me not to, but another part of me needed answers. The room seemed endless. Concrete columns stretched in every direction. Some still carried faded construction markings. Others were covered with strange patches where something had once been bolted to them. Old electrical conduits ran across the ceiling before disappearing into darkness. The man never looked back. Not once. Every 20 or 30 feet, he'd stop for a moment, as though making sure I was still behind him. Then he'd continue. The silence became unbearable. Finally, I asked, "Are you the one Richard worked with?" No reply. "What happened here?" Nothing. I kept following. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Down there, time didn't seem to behave normally. My watch had stopped. The second hand rested on exactly 1:17. The battery hadn't died. It had simply frozen. I checked my phone. The screen wouldn't turn on, no matter which button I pressed. Dead, even though I'd charged it before work. The man stopped walking. He was standing beside a massive concrete support wall. At first, it looked solid. Then I noticed the outline. A doorway. Not a steel door. Just a rectangular opening that had been filled with concrete decades earlier. The color didn't match the surrounding wall. The maintenance worker placed one hand against the concrete. Slowly, he knocked. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was dull, heavy, as though the wall was hollow. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, from the other side, 3 knocks answered. My blood turned to ice. The man lowered his hand. Very slowly, he stepped backward, still facing away from me. The answering knocks came again, this time louder. Knock, knock, knock. Dust drifted from tiny cracks in the concrete. I backed away instinctively. Another 3 knocks, harder. Hairline fractures spread across the old repair work. I shined my flashlight directly at the wall. There was movement, not outside, inside. Something was pressing against the concrete. Not enough to break through, just enough to make the surface bulge, slightly, then relax. Again, like someone testing it, or someone trapped behind it. His head tilted slightly, as though listening. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't answer." The words hit me like a punch. Richard had said exactly the same thing. If you ever hear someone knocking, don't answer. The wall shook again. This time, a voice came through, muffled, weak, almost impossible to understand. "Help." I froze. Another pause. Then clearer. "Please." The voice belonged to a woman. She sounded terrified. My flashlight trembled. "Someone's in there," I whispered. The maintenance worker slowly shook his head. "No." One word. Calm, certain. But I can hear, "No." Silence returned. Then the woman's voice changed. Without warning, it became deeper. Older. Male. "Richard." Another pause. "Open the door." I felt every muscle in my body lock. Richard. It knew his name. Then another voice. A child. "Can you hear me?" Another. An elderly man. Then another. A teenager. The voices began overlapping. Not shouting. Talking. Whispering. Calling different names. Names I'd never heard before. Then my own. I nearly dropped the flashlight. Daniel. The voice sounded exactly like my younger sister. She had died in a car accident 8 years earlier. I hadn't heard her voice since the funeral. Not once. Not in dreams. Not in recordings. Yet now, it came from behind a wall buried beneath an apartment building. "Daniel. Please. I can't find the stairs." Tears filled my eyes before I realized what was happening. My body leaned forward. One more step. Just one. The maintenance worker suddenly moved, faster than I'd seen him move before. He stepped directly between me and the wall, still facing away, still refusing to turn around. He raised one arm, blocking my path. The whispers stopped instantly, every one of them.
Silence. Complete silence. The air itself felt different.
Then he pointed behind us. I turned. Far away, barely visible between the columns, I could see daylight. Not real daylight. The pale yellow glow of the basement stairwell. I hadn't noticed it before. When I looked back, the maintenance worker was gone. There were no footsteps, no fading silhouette, nothing, just empty concrete. The sealed wall stood silent once more. No voices, no knocking, only dust drifting through the beam of my flashlight. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward the light. This time, I counted every step. 50, 100, 150. The glow never seemed to get any closer. My lungs burned. My legs ached. Yet the stairwell remained the same distance away. Only after what felt like 10 full minutes did I finally reach the open fire door leading back to the upper basement. I stumbled through it and slammed it shut behind me. The moment the latch clicked, my phone vibrated in my pocket. My watch started ticking again. 1:18 a.m., as though only a single minute had passed. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. Then I noticed something that made my stomach sink. My work boots were covered in fine gray dust. Mixed into the dust were dozens of footprints. Not on the floor, on my boots, tiny bare footprints, as if children had been standing on my feet.
Cy didn't tell Richard everything. Not that night. Not the next one either. When he asked why I looked like I'd seen a ghost, I simply said I'd gotten lost while tracing old utility lines. He looked at my boots. His expression changed immediately. The gray dust was still there. Not all of it. I'd tried washing it off in the maintenance sink. Most of it came away, but a thin layer remained deep in the seams of the leather. Richard crouched without saying a word. He brushed one finger across the toe of my left boot. Then he rubbed the dust between his fingers. His shoulders sagged. You went below. It wasn't a question. I nodded. For nearly a full minute, he didn't speak. Finally, he walked into the maintenance office and locked the door. Then, he opened the same filing cabinet I'd seen a few nights earlier. This time, he reached all the way to the back, behind the maintenance reports, behind the security photographs. Behind years of handwritten complaints was a thin black binder. No label, no date, just a faded elastic band holding it shut. Richard placed it on the desk. I've never shown this to anyone. Inside were photocopies, letters, engineering reports, insurance claims, newspaper clippings. Most were so old the paper had turned yellow. The first document was dated April 12, 1973. It wasn't a police report. It was a construction memo. The heading read, Sublevel 2, Access Restrictions. The page itself was covered with signatures. Project engineers, safety inspectors, city officials. One paragraph had been underlined in red ink decades earlier. Effective immediately, all personnel are prohibited from entering the Eastern Service Sector without written authorization. There was no explanation. The next document came 3 weeks later, a safety inspection. Several lines had been blacked out, but one sentence remained visible. Workers continue reporting unexplained knocking from behind the eastern retaining wall. I looked up. Richard nodded slowly. From without, it started before anyone moved into the building. The third document made my stomach tighten. It listed 8 construction workers by name. Across the bottom of the page, someone had stamped one word in bold red letters. Missing. No bodies? I asked quietly. Richard shook his head. None. The fourth document wasn't official at all. It was a handwritten letter. Say signature. No envelope. Just several pages folded together. The handwriting became shakier toward the end. I read the first paragraph aloud. If anyone finds this, don't let them seal the wall while people are still inside. I stopped reading. People. Richard gave the smallest nod. Keep going. The next page described workers hearing voices after every shift. Some believed trapped laborers had survived a collapse. Others insisted they heard children. One man claimed his own wife had called to him from behind the concrete. Except she'd been standing beside him when it happened. The final paragraph had only one complete sentence. It knows who you're willing to open the wall for. Silence filled the office. I closed the binder. Do you believe this? Richard answered without hesitation. No. He blinked. He continued. I don't believe walls talk. I don't believe dead people call your name. I don't believe buildings hunt people. Another pause. I believe something down there wants us to. That sentence disturbed me more than anything I'd read, because it sounded rational, not supernatural, manipulative. Whatever was behind the wall didn't need to break free. It only needed someone to let it out. I looked toward the basement door. So why not demolish the whole place? Richard gave a tired smile. They tried. He reached into the binder again and removed an insurance report from the early 80s. The building had suffered a major electrical fire. The damage was severe enough that demolition had been considered. The report ended with a handwritten note from the engineering firm. Eastern Foundation cannot be disturbed without unacceptable structural risk. Richard tapped the page. They drilled into that section once. What happened? The drill disappeared. I frowned. What do you mean disappeared? They hit empty space. Then the drill bit snapped. When they pulled the machine back, the last 6 feet of the drill shaft were gone, never recovered. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I found myself looking toward the basement stairs again. At exactly that moment, 3 knocks echoed through the floor. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock. Neither of us moved. Richard slowly closed the binder. It doesn't usually start this early. I checked the clock. 12:46 a.m. Too early. Much too early. Then the security monitor flickered. One camera, then another. Every screen showing the basement filled with gray static. A second later, they all came back online. Every corridor was empty, except one, camera B7. The hidden hallway. The black door stood closed. Every lock was visible, but someone was standing in front of it, a maintenance worker. Blue coveralls. Back to the camera. Hands at his sides, perfectly still. Richard leaned closer to the screen. I know him. My pulse quickened. Who is it? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he whispered a name. Michael, the man from the 2003 photograph. I stared at the monitor. It couldn't be. The footage was live. The timestamp in the corner was counting upward in real time. 12:47, 12:48. The figure never moved. Then, very slowly, he raised one hand, not toward the door, toward the camera. His index finger curled once, a silent gesture. Come here. The screen flashed, just for a fraction of a second. When the image returned, the hallway was empty. Richard immediately stood. He grabbed the ring of basement keys. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked terrified. We're too late. What do you mean? He was already moving toward the door. Without turning back, he said the words I still hear in my nightmares. Someone answered the knocking. He unlocked the basement door. A blast of cold, dry air rolled up the stairwell. Not damp basement air. The air from level 2, and from somewhere far below, echoing through concrete that should have been solid, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not one person, not 2, dozens, all of them, walking upstairs. The footsteps stopped halfway up the stairs. Richard and I stood frozen in the maintenance office, listening. Nothing. Not the hum of the boilers, not the rattle of old pipes, not even the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. The entire building had become unnaturally quiet. Then every emergency light flickered at once. The office was thrown into darkness for less than a second. When the lights returned, the security monitors had changed. Every camera in the building still worked. Hallways, elevators, laundry room, parking lot. Everything looked normal, except there were no people. Not a single tenant. Not cars remained outside. Apartment doors were closed. Televisions glowed through living room windows. Laundry continued spinning inside unattended washing machines. But every hallway was empty. Richard leaned toward the monitors. They're gone. Before I could ask what he meant, the office phone rang. Not the maintenance radio, the old landline, the one almost nobody used anymore. Neither of us moved. It rang again and again. Finally, Richard picked it up. He didn't say a word. He only listened. His face slowly drained of color. After nearly 20 seconds, he placed the receiver back in its cradle. Who was it? He looked at me. My wife. I remembered him telling me years ago that she died from cancer 12 years earlier. What did she say? His eyes remained fixed on the phone. She asked why I never came home. Silence filled the room. Then 3 knocks, not below us, behind us, from the maintenance office wall. Knock, knock, knock. We turned together. The sound had come from the concrete wall directly behind Richard's desk, the same wall that separated the office from the basement corridor. Richard didn't hesitate. We're ending this. He unlocked another cabinet I'd never noticed before. Inside was a heavy sledgehammer, a portable floodlight, a coil of climbing rope, 2 breathing masks. He handed one mask to me. If we get separated, he stopped, then quietly corrected himself. When we get separated. Don't follow anyone who won't show you their face. Those words made no sense. Not yet. 5 minutes later, we were descending into level 2, not through the hidden hallway, through the service staircase I'd discovered behind the boiler room. Richard had a key I'd never seen before. It unlocked a steel gate halfway down. You knew this was here. I've always known. You lied to me. Yes. Why? He didn't answer until we reached the bottom. Because everyone who learns too much eventually believes they can fix it. The lower levels seemed different. The air had grown colder. Not freezing. Dry. Still. Almost preserved. Our footsteps echoed for what felt like forever. Then we found them. Rows of work lights. Fresh extension cords. Stacks of bottled water. Portable generators. Someone had been living down here. Not for days. For years. On one folding table sat maintenance logbooks. Dozens of them. Each bearing a different year. Each written in different handwriting. Some entries dated back decades. Richard opened one. This was Michael's, the missing maintenance worker from 2003. The final pages became increasingly frantic. Day 18. I heard my father again. Day 22. The wall knows our names. Day 29. Richard says not to answer. Day 31. I finally saw who keeps knocking. The next page contained only one sentence. It was me. Nothing after that. The remaining pages were blank. Richard quietly closed the notebook. He wasn't the first. He pointed toward dozens of identical journals. Every missing maintenance worker had left one behind. Each journal ended the same way. Each journal, nothing pop note, sure, but the wall ending in words like trenches. They all believed the thing calling to them was themselves. A deep, metallic groan echoed somewhere ahead. The entire chamber vibrated. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Richard looked toward the darkness. It knows we're here. We continued deeper. Eventually, the concrete columns ended. Ahead stood the eastern retaining wall, the one from the construction reports. It stretched nearly 40 feet across. Unlike every other wall in the basement, this one wasn't cracked with age. It looked new, as though fresh concrete had been poured yesterday. Thousands of fingerprints covered its surface, pressed into the cement before it hardened. Large hands, small hands, adult, child, dozens, maybe hundreds. I stepped closer. The fingerprints weren't random. They all pointed outward, as though people trapped inside had pressed against wet concrete while it was setting. My stomach turned. Richard set down the floodlight. The beam illuminated the entire wall. In the center, someone had carved a message. Not recently. The letters had weathered with age. Do not let it learn your face. What does that mean? Richard didn't answer. Instead, he removed a folded photograph from his wallet. A younger version of himself stood beside another maintenance worker, Michael, the man who disappeared. Richard stared at the picture for a long time. I brought him down here. His voice cracked. I thought we could prove everyone wrong. He looked at me. I've been waiting 23 years to apologize. A sudden knock interrupted him. Not 3, 1, powerful enough to shake the wall. Then another, tat-tat. Hairline cracks raced across the fresh concrete. The floodlight flickered. Another impact. This time, something bulged beneath the surface, like a hand pressing outward, only it had too many fingers. Richard whispered, "It's waking up." The wall split with a sound like tearing stone. It cracked no wider than an inch, opened from floor to ceiling. Say, cold air rushed through it. Not the smell of decay, not mold, nothing earthly, just empty, dry air. Just then, faces appeared inside the crack. Not bodies, only faces, hundreds of them, layered impossibly behind one another, every age, every expression, some crying, some smiling, some screaming silently, all staring directly at us. Then every face disappeared, except one, mine. It smiled, and for the first time since entering the building, it turned around. I wish I could tell you exactly what happened after my face smiled at me from inside the wall. The truth is, memory becomes unreliable when terror takes over. There are moments from that night that remain painfully clear. Others feel as though someone cut them out of my life with a knife. The first thing I remember is Richard grabbing my shoulder so hard it hurt. Don't look at it. I couldn't. Not anymore. Because the thing inside the crack looked exactly like me. Not similar, not close, exactly. Every scar, every wrinkle, even the tiny burn mark on my left wrist from a soldering iron years earlier. It smiled wider than I ever could. Then it stepped forward, not through the crack, out of it. The concrete never broke apart. It simply let the figure pass, as if the wall had become liquid for only a second. Richard shouted something I didn't understand. The duplicate took one slow step toward us. It never blinked, never breathed. Its boots made no sound against the concrete. Then another figure emerged. This one looked like Richard, younger, healthier. His hair wasn't gray. His back wasn't bent. He looked exactly like the man in the old photograph with Michael. The younger Richard smiled. The real Richard lowered his head. I should have left you here. The duplicate tilted its head. I know. It answered in Richard's own voice, not an imitation. His voice. The same exhausted tone. The The same quiet way of speaking, only completely empty. More figures began to appear behind them. Some wore maintenance uniforms from different decades. Others wore construction helmets. One still carried a lunchbox. Another had dried concrete across his boots. Every one of them had the same expression: patient, waiting, watching. I realized something that made my stomach turn. None of them were trapped. They were trying to leave. Richard suddenly grabbed the sledgehammer. Run! He swung with everything he had. The hammer struck the floodlight instead of the wall. Glass exploded. The room plunged into darkness. For one heartbeat, I heard hundreds of footsteps rushing toward us. Then Richard screamed. Not loudly, not for long, just once. It was the kind of scream a man makes when he realizes something impossible has finally happened. I shouted his name. No answer. My flashlight had rolled somewhere across the floor. I found it by touch. When the beam came back on, Richard was gone. The sledgehammer lay where he dropped it. Nothing else. No blood, no torn clothing, no footprints. Just empty concrete and silence. I ran. I didn't care where. I only wanted to reach the stairs. Behind me, dozens of voices called my name. Some belonged to strangers. Some belonged to people I'd loved. Some belonged to people who had been dead for years. I didn't answer. I never looked back. After what felt like forever, I saw the steel fire door. This time, it was exactly where I remembered. I burst through it, climbed the stairs, forced the rusted service panel closed behind me. By the time I reached the main basement, the building was alive again. The boilers hummed. Water flowed through the pipes. Someone laughed on the floor above. An elevator chimed. Everything sounded perfectly normal, as though nothing had happened.
The security office was empty. Richard's coffee was still warm. His keys lay on the desk. His jacket hung over the chair. But Richard himself had vanished. The police searched for 6 days. They questioned every tenant, every contractor, every employee. Search dogs were brought in. Structural engineers examined the basement. Nothing. The official report concluded that Richard had suffered a medical emergency and wandered away before anyone noticed. No one could explain how a 68-year-old man disappeared from a locked building without being seen by a single camera. When detectives questioned me, I told them everything, or at least everything I thought they'd believe. I mentioned the hidden level, the journals, the wall, the voices. A week later, they called me back. The lead investigator placed a folder on the table. Inside were the building blueprints. There is no second basement. I've been there. No, you haven't. He turned every page. One basement, exactly as the city records showed. I argued. I insisted they were looking at revised plans. He quietly slid one final document across the table. It was dated 1973, the original construction drawing, stamped and signed. There had never been a level 2, not officially. I resigned the next day. Blackridge Apartments hired another maintenance technician less than a month later. I never learned his name. I moved 3 states away. I never worked maintenance again. For years, I refused to talk about the building. People wouldn't have believed me anyway. Eventually, Blackridge was sold, renovated, given a new name, fresh paint, modern apartments, luxury advertisements. Most people living there today have no idea what stands beneath their feet. Sometimes I wonder whether that's for the best. 3 months ago, I received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The security camera image was recent, high definition, digital. The timestamp showed 1:17 a.m. A maintenance worker stood at the entrance to the hidden hallway. His back faced the camera, blue coveralls, flashlight on his belt. I recognized him immediately. It was the man who replaced me. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 4 words. "He's asking for you." I burned the picture that same night. Or at least, I thought I did. The next morning, it was lying on my kitchen table, perfectly untouched. Since then, strange things have started happening again. Sometimes late at night, I wake up convinced someone has knocked on the wall beside my bedroom. Always 3 times. Never 4, never 2, just 3. Sometimes I hear footsteps beneath my house. I don't have a basement. Twice I've found fine gray dust outside my front door. Last week, my security camera captured someone standing at the end of my driveway at exactly 1:17 a.m. The recording lasted 12 seconds. The person never moved. They simply stood there, with their back to the camera. When the motion light turned on, there was no one there. I deleted the recording. I didn't want to watch it again, because I already knew what would happen if I did. I'd zoom in. I'd convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Then I'd notice the flashlight hanging from the belt. Then I'd wonder if the person ever turned around, and if they did, whether the face waiting for me would be mine. So if you ever move into an old apartment building, and someone casually tells you that the basement only has 1 level, don't ask to see the blueprints. Don't listen for the knocking. And whatever you do, if you find yourself counting the stairs on the way back up, if there are more of them than when you went down, because some places don't trap your body. They only need you to remember the way back.